Hey friends, I'm really looking forward to talking to you today about a comparison between the 6D Mark II, the 5D Mark III, the A7 II. So the 6D Mark II is a really exciting full-frame camera that Canon has recently released. It's going to have, a lot of great features like DPAF, like just over 4 times as many autofocus points as the original 6D had. It's going to have electronic image stabilization and video. It's going to have a tilty flippy touchscreen. It seems like a really great camera, and it is on paper, and I think it's one that's worth getting really excited about for a lot of people. But what I haven't seen so far is a really good comparison between the 5D Mark III, the 6D Mark II, and the A7 II, because, those are all the really big full-frame options that most people are paying attention to. More people are buying mirrorless options or Canon than any other brands, and so I want to bring those in particular to the table. And I've seen in a lot of comments, I've been a part of a lot of comment threads about this camera, and I've seen in a lot of those comments that people are like, should I buy a 6D2 or should I buy a 5D3, because they're a very similar price point. And I want to get into that. I'm really happy with my 6D. I really love it. I think it's fantastic in so many respects. And so I'm really attracted to the 6D Mark II, just on principle. However, looking at the specs on paper, what you're going to be finding is that the 6D Mark II outperforms both the A7 II and the 5D Mark III in most categories, except for flash sync speed. Despite having fewer autofocus points than the 5D Mark III, the 6D Mark II does have DPAF, which turns 80% of the sensor into phase detect autofocus points. Each pixel in 80% of the sensor turns into a phase detect autofocus point. So you're going to use that for when you're making movies or for when you're using live view. And so you're going to get really fast, really accurate performance out of that. And I don't think that that's really, I think that lacking that on the 5D3 is a huge deal. I think also that the 5D Mark III's lack of dynamic range, just like the Alpha 6300s, are really downsides. I prefer to shoot my stills on my 6D Mark I now, I guess, because of the fact that I haven't looked at these specs before, but I've been able to tell just, visually that I'm not able to pull as much out of my 6300 as I can my 6D. And so I think those extra 2 stops of dynamic range that at minimum you can expect to have over the 5D Mark III, you're going to love to have in the 6D Mark II. And while the specs on the dynamic range haven't been made available yet for that camera, I'm going to imagine that they will at least be on par with the A7 II of 13.6 stops of dynamic range. I frequently find myself in situations where I need as much of that dynamic range as humanly possible, and so I really appreciate having it. It also makes a really big difference when you're trying to process photos into HDR-esque, when you really want to mess with the color a whole bunch, when you want to really change like yellow into green if it's kind of a deserty scene, but you want it to look a little bit more vibrant, or when you want more punch in the sky. When you want to mess with those colors, that dynamic range is really going to come into play. The 4K time-lapse, the 1080p 60, the tilty flippy touchscreen, the DPAF, all make this camera, the 6D Mark II, far and away superior of a video camera than both the 5D Mark III and the A7 II. Despite the S-Log 2 in the A7 II, I don't believe that it's really going to be able to stand up to the 6D Mark II because of both 4K time-lapse and HDR movie. And between the three, those like big three, the 1080p 60, which the A7 II doesn't have, the HDR movie, which the A7 II kind of has in S-Log 2, and the 4K time-lapse, which you have to spend another $10 for. I've wanted to do it, but I've never wanted to pay $10 for it for my Alpha 6300. I think those are great features, and they're going to make a really big difference for a lot of people that want to use the 6D Mark II to make film. I would love it if you would check out my Etsy store where I have LUT packs. I grade all my footage with these LUTs that I've made, and so just checking those out would be great for me. I've tried to price them very competitively, so if you're a beginning filmmaker shooting in S-Log 3, if it's a little intimidating, those could be great for you. In terms of stills, the 1.5 frames per second more is a huge deal on the end of the 6D Mark II in comparison to the A7 II. I think that really shouldn't be ignored. And the half a frame a second more than the 5D Mark III will be felt, because you're going to have more of those shots as hits as opposed to misses, not just because you have more autofocus points than the original 64 point whatever times as many, because the 61 reticular are really good on the 5D3. You also can shoot in live view and get a lot better coverage of the entire screen. And so you're just, with that DPAF, you're going to keep reaping rewards off of that. You're almost never going to miss a shot because of that. The place where the 6D Mark II really kind of falls apart is in comparison to the 80D. If the ISO range doesn't mean anything to you, the 80D in many ways is a much better camera for DSLR filmmakers. The problem, though, arises that it is bigger and heavier, and you're going to have to use APS-C lenses, so you'll never be able to get as wide on a crop body as you would on a full frame body. And so a 16 to 35 on a crop body is going to look like a 24 to 53 as opposed to looking like a 16 to 35. And regularly using a 24 millimeter lens, I know that I really want every ounce of that 24 millimeter. I almost always want to go wider than that. And so from my perspective, the ability to crop in a little bit further with an APS-C lens and with an APS-C body and using a telephoto lens or something is actually a huge downside when I want to go wider. And so that's a huge turnoff to me on that. However, for the rest of the specs, apart from ISO range like I was talking about in 1080p 60 versus 1080p 30, the 80D is a much better camera if you want to stick with Canon's ecosystem. However, with the 77D and T7i having been released, as well as the EOS M5, there are some really good contenders if you want to stick within the APS-C system that you might already have bought into without having to jump up to full frame to really reap the rewards of better ISO performance. The Alpha 6300 is a camera that I would highly recommend for beginning filmmakers because of 4K, because of S-Log3, because of how far you can push all that. However, I would really caution you against pushing it too far. That's something that I feel like I've done more than I would like to, and the 11 point whatever stops of dynamic range really aren't enough. And so if you want to use, a mirrorless system for video, I would highly recommend either getting an external recorder or, being a little bit smarter on the front end than I was. And just for the record, the GH5 only has like 12 stops of dynamic range, so don't be pooping on my parade with this, because the GH5, as cool as 10-bit 422 is, still doesn't have the dynamic range to keep up with a lot of cameras, to keep up with a lot of modern cameras. So if it comes down to, in terms of my opinion, I'm always going to want a 6D type of body, because first off, because of all the beautiful and wonderful moments I've captured, the memories I've been able to evoke with the images that I've been able to make off of my 6D. That, what it's given me has really biased me towards the Mark II version. Now, the 5D Mark III on paper doesn't hold up to the 6D Mark II. The A7 II in many ways can keep up for a lot of it, but then also falls flat in a lot of other really important places like battery life, menu systems, stuff like that really will get in your way. However, for half the cost, an 80D or a 77D or a T7i could fill every need that you have as a filmmaker, unless going really wide is something that's really important to you. However, I'm always going to be attracted to the full frame option. I feel like I get much better images out of full frame cameras than I do out of crop cameras, and that's partially because I get more light in the frame. And so in terms of equivalence, I want to always be shooting on a full frame or larger sensor if I can help it, and that's what I do for my stills. For video, it makes sense to use a crop body oftentimes because of the Super 35 sensor being a little bit smaller than an APS-C sensor in the first place. So if you want to shoot video, it could make a lot of sense to go with those crop body options. However, that full frame aesthetic is something that's not only becoming more popular, it's also becoming more, defining of the quality of content that you can make. And so because of that, even though it's only outputting 1080p 60, the quality of content in terms of the light that you can bring in, the way you can manipulate that light with a fast aperture lens, will give you a much more cinematic look on the 60 Mark II than you could get on the 80D. Additionally, it's lighter and easier to use. The ergonomics have been worked out much more closely to the 5D system, and so it's gonna be a really, fantastic piece of kit to have. What it really comes down to, though, are your own personal preferences, because the 80D, the 77D, the T7i have a lot of the same features as the 6D. It's just not they're just not full frame. So if full frame means something to you, like it does to me, then the 6D Mark II is going to be a fantastic camera. If you need 4K, you're not going to find that usably on a Canon DSLR. You're going to need to use a Sony system, and you can't just go with an A7 II. You're going to have to go with one of the more expensive options, like the $2,600 A7S II or the $2,800 or the $3,000 A7R II. Kind of depends on what you watch this video, what the prices are like, so I apologize if I'm wrong for whenever you're watching this. For, if you don't want to spend that much money, Alpha 6300, Alpha 6500 are fantastic options. But there's always part of me that's really loved Canon's color science, really loved the way that Canon color science renders skin tones in particular. And because I do most of my color grading based on my own skin tones, and a lot of you probably will too, regardless of what kind of work you're doing, be it sports photography, wedding shooting, whatever, a lot of it's going to revolve around people. If you're, a landscape photographer, that doesn't entirely apply to you. However, the weather sealing on this camera, the 6D Mark II, is fantastic. It's not going to be 1DX level, but it's going to be really good, especially with an L series lens that also has weather sealing. So while a lot of this does come down to your own preferences, I'm going to strongly urge you to try out the 6D Mark II. Rent it, go into a camera store and try it out once it's been actually released, because I think it's going to blow you away. And I think that the 5-axis internal electronic stabilization is going to blow you away too. I think that what people are kind of missing about the 6D Mark II, because they're looking at 4K and no 4K and no dual card slots, is the fact that the cameras that you choose to use, for most of us, are investments for the next many years, right? And so they're going to need to stand up, which Canon DSLRs will do. They'll need to be able to take the punishment that will put them through, which the 6D Mark II will be able to do. It has better weather sealing than the original. I think the other thing that a lot of people forget is that the images that you can make with these cameras, regardless of what camera it is, it's not just an image. It's a moment and it's a memory. And every time you get to experience that, it's going to bring a lot of really visceral emotion up and really attach you to that device. So while I know and can recognize that my 6D is very obsolete in so many ways, it's still one of my favorite cameras because it's allowed me to make so many memories and to make so many images that have been so evocative for myself and my family and my friends and my clients. So I'm just going to encourage you to not worry too hard about specs like 4K and no dual card slots. By the way, I've never needed to have a second card slot on any of the cameras that I've ever had, so for all the people that are worrying about that don't actually know if they need one, don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. But think more about stuff like the ISO performance, where you're going to be able to use it in more situations to be able to tell more stories, to be able to evoke more memories. Or that tilty flippy touch screen where you're going to be able to point it way down or way up so you can capture a really unique moment. Think about the features that will make a bigger difference over the next 3 to 4 years. And while 1080p 60 might be out of style by then, what's also going to be the case is that devices like the Alpha 6300 are going to be cheap enough that you can pick one up if you need the 4K. So I'm going to just really exhort you to, follow what you want, right? While I know that what I want is a 6D Mark II. So the 6D Mark II has more megapixels than both the 5D3 and the A7 II. The original 6D, we don't know the dynamic range numbers on the 6D Mark II yet, but the 5D Mark III had 11.7 EV worth of dynamic range. The 5D Mark IV has 13.6, the original 6D had 13, and the A7 II has 13.6. The 5D Mark III shoots 6 frames per second, the 6D Mark II 6.5, and the A7 II shoots 5 frames per second for 50 frames. Those numbers, how large that buffer is, those numbers aren't available for the 5D3 or for the 6D2. However, with my experience with the 6D, I get, in comparison backwards, if you will, I get probably 8 or 10 raw files out of that. The 5D Mark III has 61 AF points that are, it's Canon's reticular AF. The 6D Mark II has 45 with DPAF. The 5D Mark III does not have dual pixel autofocus. And then the A7 II has 117 phase detect with 25 contrast detect autofocus points. So all 3 cameras shoot 1080p 30. However, the A7 II has S-Log2, and it shoots up to 50 megabits a second, while Canon's 1080p 30 is only up to 35 megabits a second. However, the 6D Mark II does have 4K time-lapse internal, and it shoots 1080p 60. 6D Mark II also has what's called HDR movie, which is a really great feature for a lot of people that want their films and their movies that they're making with their DSLRs to be a little bit, it's closer to what the result would be if you were to shoot in S-Log2 and then grade it. So as far as max ISO goes, the 5D Mark III and the A7 II both max out with native ISO at 25,600, while the 6D Mark II goes all the way up to 40,000. The 5D Mark III has a flash sync speed of 1/200th of a second. The A7 II has a flash sync speed of 1/250th, while the 6D Mark II has a flash sync speed of 1/180th. The A7 II has full-time physical 5-axis stabilization. The 6D Mark II has 5-axis electronic stabilization only when you're shooting movies, and the 5D Mark III has no stabilization whatsoever. 5D Mark III costs about $2,300 new, the 6D Mark II $2,000, and the A7 II costs $1,600. The thing that you got to keep in mind there is that you can get full-frame Canon lenses for less than the cost of their equivalents on a Sony system. So you're paying for that cheaper body with the cost of the lenses on the Sony. However, Canon L series lenses are fairly expensive, and so it kind of depends on the quality that you want with that, because a lot of the Sony lenses, the G lenses, the G Master lenses, the Zeiss lenses are all very high quality and will last you a good long time. However, you can't really adapt them to other systems. In terms of viewfinder, the 5D Mark III has a 100% optical viewfinder, OVF. The 6D Mark II has a 98% OVF, and the A7 II has a 100% EVF. They all 3 have a crop factor of 0.71x magnification. The 6D Mark II and the A7 II both shoot on SDXC as kind of like their max media type, while the 5D Mark III also includes CFast cards. In terms of power, the 5D Mark III and the 6D Mark II shoot off of 1800 milliamp hour batteries, while the A7 II shoots off a 1020 milliamp hour battery. So you're going to get a lot less battery out of that, as well as the fact that it's powering an LCD full-time or an EVF full-time, which means that you get much better battery performance out of the Canon options. So the 5D Mark III and the A7 II both have microphone and headphone jacks as well as HDMI, while the 6D Mark II only has a mic jack and HDMI. So the 5D Mark III weighs just about 2 pounds, 1.89 pounds, or 857 grams. The 6D Mark II weighs 1.51 pounds, or 685 grams. And the A7 II weighs 1.223 pounds, or 556 grams. So between those 3, it seems pretty clear to me what I want. I want the newer imaging processor, the Digic 7, that's in the 6D Mark II as opposed to the Digic 5 or 6 that's in the 5D Mark III. The A7 II, the Bions X, whatever that one is, really good. The thing that's really appealing to me about the A7 II is being able to adapt glass, both vintage, film glass, as well as stuff like Sigma Art or my own Canon EF lenses that I already have. The other great thing about it is that it is cheaper off the bat. However, it's also due for an update, and the 5D has already been updated into the $3,300 5D Mark IV that kind of fixes a lot of those issues like dynamic range and ISO range that the 5D Mark III kind of was really falling down in. So the 80D has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. The Alpha 6300 has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. The 80D has 13.2 stops of dynamic range. The Alpha 6300 has 11. You know what, I'm gonna screw the specs. So there's one really important thing I covered the full frame options. I'm not really going to dive into the crop body options because those are there. If you're watching this video, you probably know about them well enough to be able to know what those specs are for yourselves. But when you look at them on paper, it's really interesting because the 80D is in many ways better spec'd than the 6D Mark II. However, its max ISO is only 12,800. It doesn't have as good of a metering system as the 6D Mark II, and it doesn't have electronic image stabilization for movies, as well as being a crop body instead of full frame. So if those matter to you, it might not be worth the doubling of the cost of your camera body. The 80D even has its 1080p 30 at 90 megabits a second. It's a very video-oriented camera. It seems in a lot of ways to me, however, like it's a very studio environment-oriented camera. It's not really one that's intended for really crazy lighting conditions. While the 6D Mark II will be much better suited for those kind of crazy lighting conditions. Camera bodies like the 77D or the T7i will be better equipped in a lot of ways for those crazy lighting conditions, but I don't think that they'll really hold a candle relative to even the 5D Mark III, but especially the 6D Mark II. The Alpha 6300 really kind of comes into its own in terms of video recording with the 4K 30 with S-Log3. 100 megabits a second on that 4K is not fantastic. It's definitely better than the 90 megabits a second you get on the 1080p 30 out of the 80D. However, proportionally, it's way less. However, most of Canon's 1080p kind of averages around 35 megabits a second for the all-eye compression technique that they tend to use. The Alpha 6300 also has 425 autofocus points with 125 contrast detect autofocus points. It maxes out its ISO at 25,600 as well natively. Has a flash sync speed of 1/160th of a second. The Sony Alpha 6300 has also been described as one of the best cameras that you can get as a beginning filmmaker when you're still going to be using, as a beginning filmmaker because of both the 4K and great picture profiles like S-Log2 and S-Log3. As a small filmmaker myself, as a small YouTuber myself, I agree with that. I use S-Log3 on nearly every video, definitely for parts, but for large portions of it as well. So, the Alpha 6300 is a fantastic camera. The 80D is a fantastic camera, but what they really lack is being full frame, and I'm a huge sucker for full frame. I would love it if you would check out my Etsy store where I have LUT packs. I grade all my footage with these LUTs that I've made, and so just checking those out would be great for me. I've tried to price them very competitively, so if you're a beginning filmmaker shooting in S-Log3, if it's a little intimidating, those could be great for you. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention today. If you'd like to check out what gear that I use to make these videos, check out the links in the description. Those will take you to Amazon. They're affiliate links, and I'll get a couple pennies on the dollar if you elect to buy anything. So yeah, I really appreciate you spending your time with me in this video, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in the next one.